Saludos, it's your host, Gabe Morales, returning for another episode of Gangsters, Cops, and Politicians. In the last couple episodes, we talked about the Gulf Cartel and how they have been around for a long time, and how they created the Zetas as their paramilitary arm, and how the Zetas broke off to form their own cartel, and how the Zetas basically disintegrated into different factions as well as the Gulf Cartel. But make no mistake, these individuals are still around, and there's even more violence than there ever was before, including on American citizens. Again, like previous videos, this video was mostly taken from material from my book, How We Lost the Drug War and How We Can Win It Back. In addition to the largest cartel, the Guadalajara Cartel, and the smaller Gulf Cartel previously covered, there was the Tijuana Cartel, which was not developed yet by the Felix organization. However, there was Harry Gamboa Buckley and the Araujo family connection to the California Mexican Mafia that was covered in previous episode. On the Mexican Mafia side, there were individuals such as Joe Morgan and Champrenoso, and even Italian Mafia guys like Jimmy the Weasel Fratiano. Besides the Gulf Cartel, other cartels developed in the 1970s as well. One of these was the Guadalajara Cartel, led by Miguel Ángel El Padrino, Felix Gallardo, and his business partners, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo and Rafael Caro Quintero. These three individuals were all eventually arrested after they built up their cartel, and we'll talk a little bit about that, as well as their role in the death of Drug Enforcement Agency Special Agent Enrique Kiki Camarena, when they felt that he was too close to getting them busted, and they were enraged for his interference in their drug operations. They didn't care that he was a DEA agent, and we'll talk a little bit about that today, as well as their operations.
Kiki always wanted to do the right thing.
In order to better understand the Guadalajara Cartel, it is important to be aware of Pedro Aviles Perez, also known as El León de las Sierras, who was a Mexican drug lord in the state of Sinaloa during the 1960s. Later on, major drug traffickers like Rafael Caro Quintero and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo claimed that they learned all they knew about the trade from Aviles Perez, who was killed in the late 1970s in a shootout with federal police. And some people believe he was set up by Fonseca Carrillo, who worked for him, and his treasurer, Caro Quintero. One of Aviles' main lieutenants in the state of Chihuahua began acquiring marijuana and poppy fields in large plantations. Meanwhile, these operations were protected by state officials, none other than Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo, who was an emerging drug lord himself. He soon became known as the godfather of the Guadalajara Cartel, known as El Padrino, and also El Jefe de Jefes, boss of all bosses. Yes, it took about 20 years for him to build up his empire, but it all came crashing down, as you will soon see. Today, many people are intrigued by Felix Gallardo due to his portrayal in the Netflix series Narcos, whereby actor Diego Luna plays him. In a 2009 article that he wrote under the headline Diaries of the Boss of All Bosses, he openly wrote about dealing in cocaine, marijuana, and heroin. Felix Gallardo describes his childhood as being very poor, and he had a general lack of resources, as many people did growing up around him. He said that there was a lack of opportunities for Mexican nationals like himself, his family, and those that surrounded them. He said, quote, "Today, the violence in the cities needs a program of national reconciliation. There needs to be reconstructions of the villages and ranches to be more self-sufficient. There needs to be assembly plants and credit given at low interest rates for businesses, incentives to raise cattle and for schools." Sounds pretty good. Maybe he should have run for Mexican president. Felix Gallardo was born in 1946 in the state of Sinaloa, a state in northwest Mexico that today is known as the birthplace of many major drug traffickers. He joined the police force at the age of 17 and started working as a Sinaloa state police trooper. He even served as a bodyguard to the governor, Leopoldo Sanchez Celis. It was in this position that he became a corrupt cop and met drug trafficking pioneer Pedro Aviles Perez, who was also a bodyguard to the governor. Aviles Perez then recruited Felix Gallardo to work for him. When Aviles Perez died in a shootout with police, as stated before, in 1978, Felix Gallardo took over his business and consolidated most of Mexico's drug trafficking system under one group, the Guadalajara Cartel. So other than the Gulf Cartel, already mentioned, ran by Juan Garcia Borrego, he ran the majority of Mexico. This included a massive drug empire with ranches like Rancho Buffalo, which was a huge marijuana plantation that was over 1,300 acres and produced up to $8 billion in marijuana every year. This cartel was so successful that Felix Gallardo decided to work with the Colombians, who dealt mostly in cocaine. This would be the Cali and Medellin cartels, which I will cover in a future episode. An informant had told him about the Rancho Buffalo operation. Acting on Kiki's intelligence and surveillance, the Mexican army raided Rancho Buffalo. 450 Mexican army soldiers, backed up by helicopters, razed it to the ground. Here you see Kiki smiling happily after the raid. In the aftermath of the plantation raid, Kiki received multiple death threats. He was warned to stop his investigation, and his informant was shot 8 times with a .45 caliber pistol. But Kiki would not let this stop him. Like I said, Felix Gallardo, Caro Quintero, and Fonseca Carrillo were involved with drug trafficking since the 1970s. And in the 1980s, then, their operations were full-fledged as the biggest cartel in Mexico, the Guadalajara Cartel. As long as Felix Gallardo paid the right people, a ring of corruption protected him and his team to keep him out of jail and prison, and to keep his operations safe from police scrutiny. That was until the murder of Enrique Kiki Camarena. In this same series, Narcos, one of my favorite actors, Michael Peña, plays Kiki Camarena. The real Camarena was born in the border city of Mexicali, Mexico, which is in Baja, California. I actually visited Mexicali while I was in the Marines a few times, while I did a special stint at El Centro to guard the same compound where the Blue Angels practice. It is a very interesting city, Mexicali, and it is straight across from Calexico, California, where Camarena immigrated to as a child. His parents divorced when he was young, and the family lived in poverty. But unlike Felix Gallardo, he never decided that drug trafficking was the way to bring himself out of it. His eldest brother, Eduardo, joined the Marine Corps and was killed in Vietnam in 1965. He also had an older brother named Ernesto, who got in trouble with the law and problems with drugs. Perhaps it was this situation that convinced Kiki to later become a Drug Enforcement Administration agent. Despite difficulties, Camarena graduated from high school in 1966, and then he joined the U.S. Marines. After a 4-year stint in 1970, he returned to Calexico and joined the police department. It was there that he was on the Imperial County Narcotics Task Force. After the Drug Enforcement Administration was established in 1973, he put in for it, as they were especially seeking Spanish-speaking agents. In 1980, he had a friend who was stationed at the Guadalajara office in Mexico, and Kiki decided that he would follow, and he also brought his family with him, as seen here. On February 7, 1985, a group of corrupt Mexican officials kidnapped Camarena near the Guadalajara consulate. This abduction was in retaliation for his work on busting up the Rancho Buffalo, which Mexican soldiers had been able to find thanks to Kiki's work. Camarena and his pilot, Captain Alfredo Zavala Avelar, who ran previous missions for the CIA, were then taken to a house owned by Rafael Caro Quintero on the west side of Guadalajara, where they were tortured and killed. Later, a gruesome tape of Kiki's torture was found, and it was clear that one of his abductors was a Mexican police chief, and the DEA agent could be heard begging not to be struck again, as he was interrogated repeatedly by the narco-terrorists. About a month later, Kiki's remains were found outside of Guadalajara in Michoacan. His skull, jaw, nose, cheekbones, and windpipe were crushed. His ribs were broken, and a hole was even drilled into his head. When I talk about narco-terrorism, this is the kind of thing I mean. When Kiki was kidnapped and killed in early 1985, I was a Marine stationed at Camp Pendleton, California, getting ready for my overseas transfer to do my last year stint in Okinawa. I recall seeing the headlines of a Mexican-American Marine and DEA agent killed in Guadalajara. Shortly after the grisly discovery, Felix Gallardo and his Guadalajara cartel became suspect, although he denied any involvement in Kiki's murder. The search to find those responsible for Kiki's murder was called Operation Leyenda, Operation Legend, because Kiki was considered a legend by then in the DEA. It is said that before Rafael Quintero went to Costa Rica, he was tipped off by a corrupt police chief named Jorge Armando Pavon Reyes. Caro Quintero quickly left Mexico on March 9, 1985, almost a month after Kiki's murder. Caro Quintero fled with multiple associates and his living girlfriend, Sarah Cristina Cosio Gayona, to a villa he owned in Costa Rica. As Quintero taxied away, it is said that he opened up the door and waved a gold-plated AK-47 and said, "Next time, my children, bring better weapons, not toys." Then he waved a champagne bottle, took a swig, and went back inside the jet as he fled off to his mansion in Costa Rica. Under interrogation, Rafael Caro Quintero admitted that he and Fonseca Carrillo were at the house when Kiki was interrogated. Another informant said that there was approximately 50 to 60 people inside the house, including many corrupt Mexican officials and police officers. As our guest has stated previously, corruption in Mexico can be very deep at times and very disturbing. Under extreme pressure from the U.S. government, Fonseca Carrillo and Caro Quintero were arrested in April 1985, shortly after Kiki's death. Meanwhile, Felix Gallardo hung low on the multiple ranches he owned and stayed at friends' mansions. It is even alleged that while on the run, he stayed at the governor of Jalisco's mansion. This was Antonio Toledo Coro, and while he was on the run at these multiple locations, he called his lawyer to create a meeting in Acapulco, Mexico. It was there that he decided to divide up his territory, which was almost everything except for the Gulf Cartel, which he left to their own devices. This was Juan Garcia Abrego, already covered in a previous episode on the Gulf Cartel. The Tijuana corridor went to the Ariano Felix organization, or the Tijuana Cartel. Now, his last name was Felix Gallardo. Felix is not a very common Spanish surname. It's a pretty common first name. But I've heard some people say that he was not related to the Ariano Felix family. I haven't seen a DNA test, but I think that he was. There's just too much of a coincidence there. And I've heard some people claim that he was the uncle to them. The Juarez cartel went to Amado Carrillo Fuentes, which I'll cover in the episode very soon. Caro Quintero, even though he was captured, was given the state of Sonora. I will do an episode on his return to power in a future episode. His brother, Miguel Caro Quintero, ran it for Rafael while he was incarcerated. Joaquin Guzman Luera and Hector Luis El Güero Fama Salazar would get Sinaloa. They were soon joined by Ismael El Mayo Zambada. These three ran the Sinaloa cartel for many years. They also had an alliance at one time with the Beltran Leyva organization, who was given northern Sinaloa, although they had a split, and we'll talk about that also, as well as El Chapo, Los Chapitos, and his son, and El Mayo, who has his own faction now of the Sinaloa cartel. Kiki's murder prompted a swift reaction from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration and U.S. government officials as they launched Operation Leyenda, Operation Legend. Investigators soon identified Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo and his two close associates, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo and Rafael Caro Quintero. The U.S. government pressured then Mexican President Miguel de la Madrid to capture the culprits. And Fonseca Carrillo and Carrillo and Quintero were quickly captured, but it took a little longer to get Felix Gallardo, who enjoyed a lot of political protection. Felix Gallardo's political connections kept him safe for about 4 years until 1989, when Mexican authorities finally arrested him in his home while he was still dressed in his bathrobe, living very comfortably. It is stated that he was worth over $500 million at the time. That would be over $1 billion today. Eventually, Felix Gallardo was sentenced to 37 years in prison. Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, commonly referred to as Don Neto, was the uncle of deceased Juarez cartel founder Amado Carrillo Fuentes. After Kiki's death, Fonseca went into hiding, but like I said, was caught soon after, on April 7th, 1985. Fonseca was located in Puerto Vallarta by the Mexican army. His villa and bodyguards were surrounded, and he surrendered without much of a fight. Now, while Felix Gallardo is suspected of ordering Kiki's kidnapping, he has repeatedly said that he always believed that killing him would have been bad for business. Fonseca also did not admit to killing Camarena, and he has stated that he was outraged and even boasts that he slapped Caro Quintero for it, which made him the fall guy. Fonseca Carrillo was convicted and sentenced to 40 years in prison. He was transferred from house arrest in July 2016 because of old age, as a compassion move. In the TV series Narcos, Fonseca Carrillo is played by actor Joaquin Cosio. He was also sentenced to prison, and after 28 years, he was freed in August 2013 after a state court ruled that he had been tried improperly. But the day after his surprise release, the United States put pressure on the Mexican government, and they issued a warrant against him for involvement in drug trafficking to the United States, as well as the 1985 murder of Enrique Kiki Camarena. The United States offered a $20 million reward for his capture, and he was finally caught and arrested on July 15th, 2022, as featured in the previous Gangsters, Cops, and Politicians video. Caro Quintero is played in the series Narcos by actor Tenoch Huerta. There is a lot more I could say about the Guadalajara Cartel and the death of Enrique Kiki Camarena, but I don't have enough time. So I hope you enjoyed this short episode and that you return to watch more as we feature other Mexican drug cartels. For now, this is Gabe Morales signing off. Gangsters, Cops, and Politicians.